Joining me now is Kris Kobach, who served as Secretary of State for Kansas from 2011 to 2019. He was also the chair of the Kansas Republican Party and is currently running for the state's Republican Senate seat. Secretary Kobach, you co-chaired President Trump's Voter Fraud Commission with Vice President Mike Pence. It was established in 2017 to look into the almost 3 million votes that President Trump claimed he would have won in the 2016 popular vote if it wasn't for voter fraud. You couldn't prove a single case, though, and the president soon had to dissolve the commission. Doesn't that tell us all we need to know about the claims of voter fraud that the president and some of his Republican allies, including yourself, are repeating again in 2020?
Actually, that's not correct. The Voter Fraud Commission was dissolved because more than any commission in U.S. history, any presidential advisory commission, it was beset by more than a dozen lawsuits, 13 lawsuits to be exact, brought by the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, and other organizations of the left who did not want the commission to do its work. So they basically tied up the commission with depositions and legal action, so that the entire staff of the commission was too busy working on the legal activity as opposed to the actual mission of the commission.
But Secretary Kobach, the reality is some of the Democrats serving with you on that commission, in fact, also sued the commission because it withheld information material from them.
One did. And the other statement you made that's incorrect, not saying that you're intentionally saying it wrong, but there's been some misreporting. One of the first things the commission produced was approximately 2,000 convictions, not accusations, convictions of voter fraud since approximately 2001. Another evidence of another figure that the commission also produced, I believe in its second meeting, was that in the 2016 election, looking at 21 states alone, approximately 8,400 people double voted, meaning they voted in 2 of those 21 states. And if you had extrapolated that to the entire 50 states, which we did not have time to do, but would have done had the commission continued, the number would have certainly been in the hundreds of thousands, because it increases exponentially when you add more states to the mix. So
hold on, Secretary Kobach, because you said that one of the Democrats on the commission sued you. And in fact, that Democrat, the Secretary of State of Maine, said that you were not able to present any compelling evidence. In fact, there were no indictments or prosecutions. You also mentioned the 8,400 instances of double voting across 20 states.
There's a prosecution, an indictment, and then conviction. And those 22,000 cases were convictions. So I don't know what he said, but he obviously was one of the individuals who was, repeating the left's talking points that voter fraud doesn't exist. When you have 2,000 convictions, voter fraud does exist. As Secretary of State of Kansas, I personally prosecuted more than a dozen cases of voter fraud, most of which were double voting. That is the most
more than a dozen cases, though, out of how many millions of voters? But you mentioned, let me take you on one of the points that you made. You mentioned 8,400 instances of double voting across 20 states. But we're talking about 3 million votes, not a few thousand. You say there were 24 million extra ballots that were sent out, which presented a huge opportunity for fraud. But you were just conjecturing. I mean, look at the facts, Secretary Kobach. Over the past 14 years, there have been only 31 credible incidents of impersonation fraud, according to the Brennan Center for Justice.
The Brennan Center for Justice is a left-wing institute that I'm constantly seeing. They try to indict every time there's an instance of voter fraud. They try to claim it doesn't exist. And the 8,400 cases were individuals who double voted in those states. And then you mentioned the 24 million. The 24 million statistic comes from the Pew Center for the States, which is not a conservative group. That is a neutral group. I think most people would say it's correct. That 24 million figure is the number of inaccurate names on the voter rolls among all 50 states combined. Inaccurate consists of 4 different categories: people who've moved away to a different state, people who are deceased, people who are not U.S. citizens, and people who are double registered, perhaps under the maiden name and the married name. And the reason that 24 million is such an important number is if we were to adopt universal vote by mail, where everybody on the voter rolls gets a ballot automatically without asking for it in the mailbox, then 24 million extra ballots would be sent out. That's undeniable. And then the question is, what happens? Do all of those people then say, oh gosh, I got an extra ballot, I'll call the county election officer and make sure that the ballot is disposed of? No, some would, but a large number would probably send in the extra ballots. And so that's why.
What are you suggesting, though? Because a quarter of voters in the 2016 elections, that's 1 in 4, actually used mail-in ballots. Are you saying that a fourth of the votes were fraudulent in an election that President Trump and the Republicans actually won?
please don't try to put words in my mouth. The 24 million is a cautionary number as to why we should never adopt a system of universal vote by mail. Most states, like Kansas, have elective vote by mail. You choose whether you want to vote in person or you can request a mail-in ballot earlier. And in Kansas, we have made vote by mail very secure. There's a signature match, so a ballot won't be sent to you unless the signature matches. There's also a virtual photo ID. You send in a photocopy of your photo ID. Other states don't have those security measures, and if they don't have those security measures, then vote by mail can be more vulnerable to fraud. Someone can intercept the mailbox, they can request your ballot for you, which happened in Kansas more than 50 times before we adopted those protective measures. So vote by mail can be very safe, but it can also be very prone to fraud, and in most states it is more prone to fraud.
But your claims that it is prone to fraud in most cases is just not supported by the facts. 5 states, Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Utah, and Washington actually use mail-in ballots as the primary form of voting. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, again, none has had any significant voter fraud scandals. Oregon, which has sent out more than 100 million ballots since 2000, in fact, has seen only 12 proven cases of fraud, which is just a tiny fraction. It's less than 1 in a million.
If you're getting your talking points from the Brennan Center for Justice, you're getting your talking points from a
But what are your facts? Where is the evidence to support your allegations of fraud?
No, let me tell you. Okay, so those 5 states have universal vote by mail, which is the type of system I say is very prone to fraud, and I hope we never have across the entire country. I can tell you that in Colorado, which adopted that system just a few election cycles ago, the Secretary of State of Colorado told me personally that in the election after they adopted it, just looking at the legislature, which is a relatively small number of people, one of the state legislators got 2 ballots in the mail, one under her married name and one under her maiden name. It is undeniable. It is an indisputable fact that there are 24 million extra names on our voter rolls, additional names. And in fact, 250 counties in the United States have more people on the voter rolls than exist in the county of voting age than are alive in the county. So this.
But you are running, Secretary Kobach, for a Senate seat actually in just a few days, and this is what you tweeted on July 24th. You said Tuesday, July 28th, 2020 is the deadline for voters to apply for advance ballots by mail for the primary. Kris needs all of his supporters energized and ready to vote for him. Why invite voters to apply for advance ballots by mail if, as you say, they lead to fraud?
No, it's interesting. I actually didn't send out that tweet or the text, whatever it may be.
That was tweeted from your account.
No, it's not. There's a huge number of outside groups that have been intervening in Kansas nationally on both the right and the left, trying to influence the outcome of this U.S. Senate race. It's one of only 4 open U.S. Senate seats in the entire country. And right now I'm one of the 2 candidates who's leading in the polls in a very, very tight race. And so, yeah, it's been an extraordinary amount of manipulation, people coming in and sending texts, tweets, ads. Over $4 million worth of ads have been put in this race against me. So, yeah,
But are you saying that you do not want people to vote by mail in your state?
No, I never said I don't. What I said earlier, if you may recall, is that Kansas has a very, very safe vote by mail system because we have those precautions. I have no concern that Kansas is going to see voter fraud by mail. Other states, like California, for example, will be an example of a state that has virtually no cautionary protections on vote by mail. So in Kansas, we'll be fine.
In Kansas, you'll be fine. But what do you say to those critics of yours and of President Trump who say that this really is about suppressing votes and limiting the Democratic turnout? If turnout is higher than it was in 2016, they say Trump doesn't stand much of a chance. He himself said this year, if you have higher levels of voting, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again.
I disagree with that completely. I don't know what are you saying is about suppressing votes. I disagree with the statement that if you have a high number of votes, you can't elect Republicans. That's false.
But do you disagree with the president's statement in which he said that if you have high numbers of people voting, if you have higher levels of voting, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again?
I'm not aware exactly of that. This is the first time I've heard that statement. So I'd have to see the entirety of the statement. But no. I mean, I think you can have large numbers of people voting, and you can have an outcome either way. In fact, One of the things we saw in 2010, for example, which was a wave year for Republicans, was that there was a very high number of people voting in a non-presidential year, and it was Republicans coming out in massive numbers. Similarly, the converse happened in 2018. You saw a huge wave of Democrats coming out. This is very typical in the American political system, where in the election 2 years after a new president takes office, usually the other party sees a wave, a surge in voting for their party in Congress and in governor's races, and et cetera.
But why, Secretary Kobach, are Republicans in general so opposed to mail-in voting? Because they are going to the courts in more than a dozen states, including 4 battleground states, Florida, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, to fight attempts to expand mail-in voting. Why are Republicans so afraid?
Well, I think you're misstating what's happening in those. So as I've made clear, mail-in voting can be made perfectly safe. It is not perfectly safe in the majority of states. I know that, for example, in Wisconsin, the litigation there is about having different standards. So in some of the more Democrat-leaning counties, they are pushing out mail-in ballots to everybody, versus in some of the more Republican-leaning counties, they have a different standard for who is sent a ballot. And so what they're contesting there is not treating all counties the same. So to say that Republicans are opposed to people voting by mail oversimplifies and distorts what's actually happening in that litigation.
But would you agree that the president has voted several times by mail? So has his daughter, his son-in-law, his press secretary, several members of the cabinet, and yet they're opposed to it. I mean, isn't there some kind of contradiction?
What the president is opposed to is universal vote by mail, as am I, where everybody is forced to get a ballot in the mail just by virtue of the name being on the voter roll, and there are 24 million extra names, and so you will have 24 million extra ballots floating around. That's what he's opposed to, and that's what I'm opposed to.
All right, former Secretary of State of Kansas, Kris Kobach, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So, can states ensure that all votes will count and that voters can have faith in the results of the election? Joining me now is the Secretary of State of Maine, Matthew Dunlap, who will be overseeing the state's election in November. He was also one of 4 Democrats appointed to Trump's 2017 Voter Fraud Commission. After a legal battle, he reviewed commission documents and issued a scathing rebuke of the allegations of fraud in the 2016 election. Secretary Dunlap, you served on the same commission as Kris Kobach, a commission that was tasked with investigating claims of millions of fraudulent ballots in 2016, and you said there was no real evidence of it anywhere. You called it the most bizarre thing I've ever been part of. What does your experience and the commission's findings tell you about the assertions made by the president that the 2020 election will lead to massive fraud?
Well, knowing how elections are run in this country, certainly in the state of Maine, when the president of the United States was still the president-elect and said he would have won the popular vote as well as the electoral college, if not for 3 to 5 million illegal votes cast, all of us who work in elections just kind of shook our heads about that, because we certainly know how elections are run and how tabulations are certified. And there's absolutely nothing to back up the president's statement. But because the president had so emphatically said that, then informed the commission, we saw it as an opportunity to talk about how elections are really run. Now, I got kind of walled off in that process, and that's why I filed the lawsuit to find out what we were working on and who we were talking to, and really even what our schedule was, and was granted the preliminary injunction by a district court, and the president dissolved the commission right after that. The documents we did get showed a framed out report about voter fraud, even though we'd only had 1 substantive meeting and had never framed out a scope of work. So it was all sort of intellectually dishonest on its very premise. And what we saw in the documents that we reviewed afterwards only affirmed that.
And so what do you expect to see in 2020? Should we expect another commission or something potentially far worse?
Well, it's hard to say. Right now we're moving forward with the conduct of the 2020 election, all 50 states. I don't foresee any major hiccups going forward. We just got through with our primary on July 14th. And running an election, a statewide election in the time of a global pandemic, presents its own unique challenges, as you might imagine. But we don't foresee any further trouble going forward after the 2020 election. We anticipate that everybody who wishes to will be able to cast a vote and have that vote be counted. And then we will deal with what happens in the aftermath in 2021, whoever wins the presidency and is our leader of this nation of ours. So we'll see what happens.
We'll see what happens, but many people already suggest that we could be moving towards a likely contested election with all the mail-in voting, the delays, the logistical challenges that could create, unless it is a clear-cut landslide victory for either candidate. What do you say to that?
I think every vote counts, and I don't think it has to be a clear-cut landslide victory to make that determination. Of course, no two jurisdictions run their elections exactly the same way, so I can't speak with any expertise as to how all mail elections are conducted in Oregon, for example, as opposed to the straight runoff system that they have in Louisiana. Every state runs its own elections according to its own laws. What we've seen this year to date is that the elections have gone fairly smoothly, with the notable exceptions of Wisconsin and Georgia, where they had significant lines, a lot of court cases. The work that we do in advance of the election is try to prevent that and provide certainty to the voters. And I think if we do those things, we will have a very clear picture of who has won the 2020 presidential election and all the congressional races as well, not to mention the legislatures. So I think if we are able to maintain our composure and follow the law and use the systems that are provided to us in those laws, I don't think we should have anything disputed in the election in the aftermath.
You don't foresee any problems, but some are voicing serious concerns already about whether all sides will indeed accept the results. Your job as Secretary of State will be to certify the vote. The Republican Secretary of State of Washington, Kim Wyman, said this.
My biggest concern is for the fall election is election administrators' job is to convince the losers that they lost. And right now, as we sit here in June 2020, I guarantee you that half of the country cannot conceive that Republicans could win in November. The other half of the country cannot conceive that Democrats can win.
How concerned are you that voters on either side will not accept the results, or that the president might contest their legitimacy? He said he would have to wait and see.
Well, during the time of the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity, a reporter asked me the question in response to something that Secretary Kobach had said about, did he believe that Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had won the popular vote? And Kobach said, we may never know. My response to that is that we know mathematically, because all 50 states certified their results. Now, certification is an affirmation of the results that are compiled at the local level. So it's not a mystery. And I think under that premise, under the rule of law, I think you'll see a peaceful transition of power if there is one, and an acceptance of the results if there is not.
And you have said recently that absentee balloting is going to be a critical factor in the November election. In your state, Democrats have dominated the request for absentee ballots during the recent primaries. Why are Republican voters in Maine, though, and across the country, so staunchly opposed to expanding mail-in voting? According to recent polls, 51% of Republicans say it would be a terrible idea.
I think that's partly because of the emphatic statements of the president saying that mail voting is subject to categorical instances of fraud. We don't see that. And I think that that's probably why you have such a strong Republican following along that philosophy. However, what we see is that people have made use of the absentee ballot in record numbers in this past primary in Maine. And then in the 2018 election, which was a contested primary in both party elections for the race for governor, for example, we issued about 35,000 absentee ballots. This past primary, we issued almost 200,000. So, and that's partly because of the pandemic, but also because we have a process that people trust. And I think that the absentee ballot process, it does have a strong chain of custody, is not subject to the type of fraud that people fear in other scenarios. But I think every jurisdiction has safeguards to their elections that the voters should trust. And if they don't, they should ask their election officials. Don't turn to social media for questions about the conduct of an election. Talk to your local election officials, your state election officials, and ask detailed questions about how this process works. That's where the trust comes from.
But the trust also comes from the president himself making statements that would not cast doubt on the legitimacy of the elections. He raised many eyebrows and some serious concerns recently when he refused to commit to honoring the results of the election. You say it'll be a peaceful transition of power, but how concerning is this for you and other secretaries of state?
I think it's reckless and irresponsible for any senior public official, not without any evidence whatsoever, to say that the election will be undermined. because that does cast doubt among the voters. Somebody in a position of knowledge and power saying that the election will be undermined by mail-in voting and voter fraud. People really care about their role as citizen legislators. And when you have complicated issues on the ballot, they want to make sure they do the right thing. They don't want to make a mistake. All it takes is for a governor or for the president to say these types of things, and people will stay home. It gives them the excuse to not vote. And that's the real tragic outcome. My job as the chief elections officer is to provide a transparent, accountable election that has integrity to the voters of Maine, that they have confidence in, and that they can vote without fear, that their vote will in fact be counted, and they can do it without endangering themselves in this time of the pandemic. That's what we were able to do in the primary. We actually had double the turnout we normally have in a primary, partly because of the safeguards we put in place and the information we put out before the election. So I think going forward into November, that's our only antidote to doubt and fear, is to bring certainty and truth to the process.
But what do you make of the president's other statement that millions of mail-in ballots will be printed by foreign countries and others? It will be the scandal of our times, he tweeted. How vulnerable would this election be to foreign interference?
I don't think very vulnerable at all. And frankly, I don't know why he would say anything like that other than to further sow doubt in the conduct of the election. We use all paper ballots in Maine. They're printed right here in the state of Maine. Most states do it that way. And in the states that don't do it, they may not have their ballots printed in their state, but they're printed by a vendor in another state. All of our ballots, to my knowledge, are printed domestically. I don't know why the president would say something like that other than to further gin up fear about what's happening this coming November, and also to cast doubt on the results, as you stipulate earlier. I don't think the results are going to be so mutable that they cannot be trusted in the November election. And I think once we certify those results, it'll be something that can be accounted for and double checked and seen again by the voters if they wish to. This is a very transparent process, and that's what we have to count on.
Secretary of State Matthew Dunlap, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you.
Thank you.